For the average person in the United Kingdom compared to the average person in the US in terms of the amount that you pay for healthcare and the actual outcomes, the US system is just performing much worse. I'm afraid we need to be very worried about the tech companies. We are trusting Elon Musk or Sam Altman or Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page with our futures. And we're betting the entire American stock market on it. The prices have soared and people are quite right to feel that in some ways their lives are less good than their parents were and that their children's lives are going to be less good than theirs. Maybe fear is part of the structure of American politics. The United States represented the hope of the liberal global order. I mean, it sounds now a very old-fashioned thing to say. All good politics of any sort is based in morality, and morality is about understanding that other people have claims which are equal to your own.
Rory Stewart, former soldier, member of parliament, cabinet minister, co-host of the #1 podcast in the UK, Rest is Politics. What other honorifics am I leaving out, sir? There's a lot of them.
Honorifics. At the moment, I'm teaching at Yale. I'm a professor at Yale. Yeah.
We'll put that. So I'll call you professor too.
That's right. Exactly. Please don't do that. Yeah. Thank you.
You had an amazing conversation with Jon Stewart in April, where you ended it with a discussion that Jon reiterated about this being potentially a moment of opportunity of something that may be built in the shadow of this chaos. Do you think since then anyone has seized on that moment of opportunity, or do you think we're still in kind of doom and gloom chaos at this point?
I mean, we live in a very strange world, don't we? In which so many indicators are objectively going wrong. I mean, I don't just mean in terms of how we feel, but if you look at indicators on median income growth, in other words, what matters to ordinary people, how ordinary people's incomes are faring. If you look at indicators on inequality, and increasingly, unfortunately, indicators around employment and what technology is doing, and look at what's happening with refugees around the world, a number of refugees, number of armed conflicts, there's a lot of the data is going objectively in the wrong direction. So people are not just panicking. They're not just being unreasonable. There's clearly something going wrong in the US, in Europe, around the world. At the same time, of course, we live in cultures that are desperate for optimism. So Dan, there's endlessly people will say, and I'm sure you find this all the time, give us a note of hope, give us some optimism to finish this whole thing off. And the process of generating optimism often can end up being a little bit plastic and fake. There's a great narrative, of course, you writing a book. Oh, you've described the problem. What's the solution? Very American. Don't give me the problem, give me the solution, right? But usually the solution bit of it, which is the last chapter of that book, is pretty flimsy. If I was to say to you, these are the 3 things we need to do and the world is suddenly going to be a better place, you'd be like, come on. What on earth is 3? And certainly at the moment, I feel that we really, and when I say we, I mean people who, broadly speaking, believe in what used to be called progressive or centrist views. I mean, all these terms are now getting discredited, are struggling to provide an exciting, compelling narrative to get people to vote for us.
And do you think that is because of this, and I'll speak for America, which I obviously know a lot more than the UK, but Donald Trump has created a fear-based framing of, you're being robbed of X because Y people are getting it. I think people are scared in general in the right track, wrong track polls, despite the fact that, there are some indicators in terms of the stock market, what have you, it continues to grow. People are very scared and they feel their personal situation keeps getting worse. They see, Donald Trump talking about tariffs, but then they see their grocery bills continue to go up. How do you think that how you described and the fear that people have is being led by our leaders who set a tone, at least in America, I feel at least, that create a structure where you can do nothing but feel pessimistic because of the way he's sending that message?
Yeah. Well, I guess you've put your finger on 2 different things. There's the grocery bill problem, and then there's the feeling of fear. And of course, they're related. I mean, uh, people say that, inflation since 1990 hasn't been that high by historical standards, but that's if you look at grocery bills. If you look at what's happened to the cost of people's housing, what's happened to the cost of a college education, what's happened to healthcare, the prices have soared, and people are quite right to feel that in some ways their lives are less good than their parents were, and that their children's lives are going to be less good than theirs. But on top of that reality is this completely strange, often videos, social media, viral driven types of fear that may not relate to that. I mean, let's give an example, one that you're more familiar with than anyone. Crime rates in cities, could objectively be coming down, and yet the perception projected by Trump is I need to deploy the National Guard or the military into DC. At Portland, Oregon, we're in war in Portland, Oregon, right? And there are all these people walking around drinking lattes and going on half marathons. And it's a kind of
juxtaposition,
yeah, and we had something. I mean, it does relate a little bit to Trump. It's a UK example, but a guy called Nigel Farage, who's now the leader of what's polling as the biggest party in Britain, this new far-right party called Reform. When asked about what's going wrong in Britain, his answer is, look at your phone. And what he means is, look at all these TikTok videos made by, tens of thousands of people saying the country's broken, there are immigrants everywhere, the crime is out of control, this country is a mess. And it's not based on data. It's not really based on, many of the things which are incredible about the United States. I mean, it is still obviously the largest economy in the world. It's got the most incredible lead in all this stuff, technology, productivity. It's got the smartest, most thoughtful people in the world. It's one of the most pleasant places. I mean, half the world wants to move to the United States and live there, which is a pretty good indicator that something's going right? And yet there is that feeling of persistent fear. And I wonder whether it isn't something to do with our culture, which makes us fearful, almost irrationally fearful, paranoid about the world, and that social media makes that worse. And I think my final thought there is that I saw this actually first after 9/11. I could begin to see this sense of how easy it was to create an atmosphere of fear. But maybe older people would say, well, it was true with communism in the 1950s, that maybe fear is part of the structure of American politics.
Where do you think the end game is on, end game is the wrong term, but the next step is in terms of trying to put some guardrails around, the social media algorithm, new media that is causing, in my opinion, at least, a little bit of a doom loop, because people do go on their phones and the algorithms can influence behavior significantly. I remember when I worked at a tech company, a tech startup, when we wanted to work in the UK, we had to, abide by GDPR and data privacy that the United States doesn't have. I think there's a lot of pressure because they're American companies and a lot of, candidly, elected officials who don't have the spine to stand up to them because of donors or what have you, who aren't regulating it here as much as they should. Do you have a model in your head as to how we proceed? And if we don't check these tech companies, do you think that this is just going to continue to throw gasoline on the fire of a divided country and world?
Yeah, I'm afraid we need to be very worried about the tech companies. Many of the entrepreneurs and leaders of these companies are incredibly impressive human beings. I mean, they're highly intelligent, highly capable. They've built incredible businesses, and many of them are well-meaning and think they're doing good in the world. But the truth of the matter is that they are running things which are functional monopolies and set out to be monopolies, and are very determined to make an enormous amount of money. And as they become wealthier and wealthier, are unfortunately insulated from the world. I mean, they begin to develop the problems that European kings developed, which is that you get surrounded by flatterers, and it's very difficult for anybody to tell you the truth. And however hard you try, and I'm sure they're trying, they're intelligent, relatively young people, or they probably want to get feedback, but their relationships are distorted. So we are trusting Elon Musk or Sam Altman or Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page with our futures. And we're betting the entire American stock market on it. And a lot of the economy is bet on these companies. And we're having to trust them on social media. We're now having to trust them on AI, which is like potentially an existential risk to humanity, and we're trusting them. So I think that's the first thing. Right? Your starting point, which is we should be very, very skeptical about a model that says, don't regulate us, you don't understand us, if you regulate us, China's going to lead, the economy will collapse, right?
They like saying that a lot, yep.
Yeah, love saying that, right? So be very skeptical
Convenient.
about it.
Yep.
Now, what is the right kind of regulation? Well, I think that's a reasonable conversation. I mean, it is true that governments are quite slow. We may not understand the tech properly. So we need a conversation with them. We need to talk about what we're scared of. And we need to work with them to work out what it is they need to do to prevent that happening and how we regulate it. There's a pompous way of saying, you don't want to get stuck into a binary conversation where they keep saying to you, well, you say you want to regulate us, but what do you want to regulate? You don't know anything about our company. You don't understand the large language model. You can't regulate us. And I think we're beginning to see some things. Right? I think there is clearly some evidence that social media and smartphones are having a damaging impact on young people. There clearly is a very, very strong potential causative link between social media and political polarization, fake news, and all the kind of advances of populism, authoritarianism we see. And then we can go on. Like, I mean, you can talk about 50 other dimensions to this. How do we deal with this? Well, look, Australia tries one model, Europe tries another model, the UK tries another model. Generally speaking, as you say, when they're tried, everyone says, oh, these are Luddites and totally ridiculous countries, and we'll just ignore them and push on and do our own thing. And of course, the truth is that it's not a very good environment at the moment because Donald Trump's instincts are not to regulate. In fact, you can see that as soon as he comes into office, Facebook got rid of a lot of its content moderation. X under Musk got rid of a lot of its content moderation. It's not that we've had a problem a year ago that we're still trying to fix. We've actually gone backwards. Right? I mean, all the attempts we made to fix this have been, well, not all of them, but many of them have just been undone.
I mean, I remember in the Biden administration, we put some of the initial strategic plan out around how to regulate AI, everything down to figuring out some kind of common watermark to put, on an AI generated image. And of course, Trump comes in, undoes all of that. To your point, has less regulation in a time where regulation and the maturity process of AI is so critical. It's not a perfect analogy, but I almost analogize it to in the United States, there was this big push around anti-tobacco efforts. And there was this famous congressional hearing where all of the heads of the top tobacco and companies raised their arms and said that nicotine was not addictive. And it took many, many studies and proof to show that nicotine was addictive and that cigarettes were causing cancer. And then there was a sea change in terms of regulation, et cetera. To your point, there are so many studies that are now coming out that I think at some point it will be impossible to ignore. But I'm curious, in the UK, do you feel like the UK has a different perspective on the dangers of social media that the United States does, or is everyone still just trying to figure out how to move forward?
I think we do have a different perspective, but the problem for the rest of the world is because you actually have these companies and we don't, our leverage is very limited. So we tried to do the first global AI summit just before, in fact, that Biden initiative that you talked about. And it's kind of embarrassing looking back at it. It involved Elon Musk being interviewed by our prime minister on a stage just over a year ago. And we began some of these conversations around AI safety, and all the kind of big names were there, from Elon Musk to Jeffrey Hinton on the scientific side. And we sort of thought that we were beginning to develop ways of talking about AI safety and inspection and advancements and innovation and what we were worried about and what an accountability mechanism could look like. And Biden was interested in this. And as you say, the Biden administration developed quite a lot of this, although it being the US, quite a lot of the stuff that we thought we were all agreeing was going to be mandatory was becoming voluntary. So Biden took quite a lot of the stuff and it goes on voluntary frameworks, voluntary guidelines. And then, of course, by the time Trump comes in, it stopped. I mean, what is the way to deal with it? Well, I think the first thing is that there are two basic paths on AI. Either the whole thing is a complete boondoggle and a pyramid scheme, and actually these models aren't going to be able to do 1/4 of what Sam Altman claims they'll be able to do. In which case, there's one kind of problem, which is probably a significant financial problem, which is that people have bet hundreds of billions of dollars on models which are not going to deliver what they were promised to do. The other more serious problem, though, for the long term, is that actually they do succeed in developing artificial general intelligence, superintelligence, within a year and a half, 2 years, which is what you keep hearing from key figures in this field. And then there's huge numbers of problems. I mean, problem number one, which is the one we need to worry about before we worry about us all being killed. And don't stop worrying about us all being killed. I think there is a perfectly plausible route to us all being killed. But before you get into that, it's just monopoly. It's that effectively, whoever develops that first super intelligent large language model can concentrate almost all economic power in the world in their single company. If this thing can do everything they claim it can launch billion-dollar companies with 2 employees, create the entire security and defense structure for the whole world, transform public services, and it's all sitting in the hands of Dario Amodei or Sam Altman. Of course, it's a problem for the rest of the world because it's in America, but even for Americans, it's a problem because it's sitting in the hands of the private sector, and in particular, 2 or 3 people in the private sector.
Well, what I think is interesting about that point is with the rise of these mega companies where the profits are, or the revenue and eventually profits are just through the roof, the immense amount of wealth that was created in California, it is given rise to not just Donald Trump, but also new faces in the party like Zohran Mamdani, for example, in New York, who are just out there beating the drum on, rich people are getting all of these benefits and, middle class and working class people can't even afford to live in New York City. He's turned the argument in a very compelling way. Basically, when people say, well, what are you worried about? The classic line is, about, well, if you raise taxes in cities too much, all the tax base will move out. But his argument, which you can't really counter compellingly, is there are people moving out of New York every day because it's too expensive. And so you're just going to care about rich people. And that has resonated, I think, among many income levels. And so I'm curious in your perspective, especially someone coming from a UK perspective, on candidates like Zohran Mamdani and how you think these are interrelated with your seeing with the rise of, a very small set of companies just having immense wealth.
So I think Mamdani is coming from a classic socialist background. I mean, I think he's somebody who is skeptical of the private sector, skeptical probably of the profit motive, doesn't say it like that, very comfortable with big government. I mean, he feels like somebody who's on the left of British politics in that way. But he's a startling communicator. He's funny, he's charming, he stages things beautifully, and he articulates so powerfully human truths. And he does it with incredible sort of intelligence and flexibility. But I still think his critique is a critique fundamentally that could have been made almost any time in the past century, which is there are very rich people and there are a lot of poor people. We're now moving into a different world where the problem will not just be that there are retired bankers able to buy fancy apartments in New York City. We're moving into a world which feels much more like the world when Rockefeller controlled all the oil or half the oil of the world, where if AI goes in that direction, this stuff will be more central to our lives than oil or electricity. And it will be held in hands that can weaponize dependency. I mean, at the moment, Zoran's narrative is still about social injustice. But this future narrative is about the way that economic monopolies of that sort are about power and everything that goes with power. in very, very disturbing ways, and possibilities of impoverishing other people and other countries on a scale that we've never seen before. I mean, let me just sort of develop that. Let's say AI developed in such a way that you needed very, very few employees. Millions and millions of people were laid off. Let's say European companies found they simply couldn't compete. So we were just laying off 20, 30, 40% of our workforce. And the companies that were destroying us were California-based companies. What you're looking at is a huge sucking of wealth into the hands of an ever smaller number of people in California, and dystopian consequences, right? There's not a great opportunity in that for somebody living in West Virginia or Mississippi. There's not a great opportunity for that, actually, for anybody living in Mexico. I mean, this becomes a very, very strange world, and it would be interesting to see when people like Zoran begin to get onto that. They may do. And paradoxically, one of the things that may happen is that this billionaire class may find that they face semi-revolutionary moments. That oddly, what may stop this revolution may be that somebody from the far left or the far right is elected with a public vote that says, we're not having this, and then the government will go after these companies.
Well, that's what frustrates me about the Democratic Party and my party is that in an objective term, we are supposed to be the party of working people who are supposed to be fighting for injustice that corporations may impose on working people, standing with unions against corporations. I think in part, and I don't want to blame it all on this, but in part because of the rise of wealth in the tech sector that has come with, an insane amount of money from that entire industry. I think that there's been a softening. This is my opinion. I think there's been a softening from the Democratic Party on its message about how we take on those who are employing people so that it's done in a just way. And so I think this is just my perspective, but I think people saw Donald Trump as arguing that you're getting screwed in a way that many Democrats didn't have that message. And I think to our peril, we let that linger. And as a result, unfortunately, and I'm a big believer in unions, and I've talked to many union members, they feel as if the Democratic Party left them, right? And this is not a whole other conversation about some of the other issues that people say Democrats spend too much time on, but they don't hear that the Democratic Party is prioritizing how they're going to make their lives more affordable and how they're going to be for them and not the employers, right? And that, to me, is a very interesting thing that if Democrats don't get right soon, it's just going to, the parties just continue to atrophy, in my opinion.
Yeah. So Dan, I was at the Chicago conference which crowned Kamala Harris, and I was very struck that there was one union speaker, I think, in the main day.
Yeah, Sean
and he
Fain.
was the only guy that referred to the working class. Everybody else was talking about the middle class. There was no attempt really to, well, that's not quite fair, sorry. Some of the people on the first day tried to tell narratives around factories and factories that were saved and things that were done. But from the perspective of a British observer, that Democratic Party was not what we would mean by a left-wing party. That was a party that looked much more like what in Britain would be Cameron Conservatives, so sort of a centrist right party in terms of its economic policy, its tax policy, its welfare policy, any of the stuff, right? It wouldn't begin to categorize itself as a left-wing party in European terms. And so I couldn't really see how it was going to be able to hold or appeal to a working class base. I mean, it seemed to be a party of graduates. A lot of the narrative was wonderful, but it was progressive narrative about identity and about culture. And now, of course, equally, I mean, I'm with you. I mean, I wanted Kamala Harris to win. I did not want Trump to win, and I still am struggling to understand how he did it because it's traumatic. I mean, it's very difficult to understand how the American people vote for him a second time when they've seen him the first time and then had him indicted and January 6th and the rest of it. And I think part of the problem presumably for your colleagues, certainly I feel this in British politics, is we haven't yet produced an honest, consistent analysis of what we did wrong. Right? The only real hope of winning again is to be able to say to the public, I get it. this is what we did wrong. This is how we're going to be different. This is the direction in which we're going, and do it with real conviction. Right? So it doesn't sound like you're saying, it sounds like you really understood. You fucked up. You did something wrong. Now, that doesn't mean throwing everything out, because equally that would be absurd. Right? I mean, you wouldn't trust me as a business partner if I said everything I did with my last business was completely idiotic. But I need to be able to tell you if I've gone bankrupt, these were the one or two big mistakes that I made, and I've learned from them.
And to the point of your British perspective, I love your honest take, because I think that Americans are incredibly insular at times and maybe don't quite understand the breadth of America's stature in the world, its place in terms of a leader among nations. You are the former Secretary of State for International Development, so obviously you've seen from an international and developing world perspective what aid from the United States can do. So I think it would be incredibly helpful if you're willing to talk to our listeners about, from your perspective, how important United States leadership has been in your lifetime, and what you're seeing now as a result of Donald Trump's frame of leadership.
Well, I began as very briefly in the British military, and then as a British diplomat. And I was in Bosnia and Kosovo, those kind of big interventions, and in Iraq and Afghanistan. I worked closely with people like Richard Holbrooke. I knew David Petraeus, the general, well. I had the privilege of doing some stuff with Hillary Clinton. And through my whole career, so this is starting in 1990 onwards, the United States represented the hope of the liberal global order. I mean, it sounds now a very old-fashioned thing to say. I accept. Right? A lot of my students at Yale listening to that would say, are you out of your mind? We did all these terrible things. We were hypocritical. We committed all these crimes. Nevertheless, it was the United States that led that intervention in Bosnia, which ended a war, which put war criminals on trial, which stabilized that country. It was the United States that helped build the infrastructure of the United Nations, that helped us set climate goals, set the goal of making poverty history. USAID, your development agency, was, in dollar terms, by far the largest agency in the world. And along with many things it did wrong, of course it did many things wrong, but it transformed life expectancy in infants. It led the humanitarian responses to famines. It transformed vaccines around the world. And American diplomats and American soldiers and American senators had a degree of seriousness and global knowledge which was quite unlike any country on earth. I could get off a plane in Washington, D.C., and I could be confident that if I wanted to know about what was happening in Somalia or South Sudan, this was the place to find a really serious, thoughtful analysis. And that was essential, because America, after the Second World War, was 40% of the global economy. Still remains about a quarter of the global economy in different measures. There are many, many people around the world who, since the Second World War, have been tempted to resent the United States, been suspicious of the United States, can point to things that America did wrong around the world. A lot of things. Vietnam, Latin America, etc. But the miracle of the US from 1945 till 2025, maybe 2016, was that it managed to still stand for things. It stood, for better or worse, for liberal democracy. It stood for solidarity. It stood for human rights. And you can see this in speeches from Eisenhower through Kennedy and onwards. I remember an ambassador in Rwanda saying to me, when I said, you're being very courageous, talking about human rights when none of the rest of us are, she said, if we don't, who else will? And now, this organization, this United States, which was the cornerstone of the United Nations, which had the United Nations in New York, holds the General Assembly, that created NATO, that created peace in Europe, that used its nuclear deterrent to keep those countries safe, that helped construct the World Trade Organization and the global trade, which has brought prosperity to untold numbers of people. seems to be turning around and revealing a very different face and saying all these institutions which we built, which we presented as altruistic, are in fact a protection racket. And everything we said about Ukraine and supporting you, forget about it. And by the way, you can give us $500 billion in minerals. And everything we said about, how NATO and the Article 5 guarantee, we can forget about that too. But if you wouldn't mind spending more of your GDP on defense than we do, not 3.5%, but 5%, and buy our weapons, well, maybe we'll continue to fight defense. And as for the UN, well, screw it. We're going to stop funding the UN agencies. We're going to stop funding the humanitarian response. We don't do any of this stuff. And we're going to ask you to do it instead. Well, would you mind going into Haiti, providing all the policing, all the money? We're not going to do it, but we're going to tell you to do it. Would you mind sorting out Gaza? I'm going to sit down with Netanyahu, come up with a plan. No, there's not going to be any American money, not going to be any American troops on the ground. You guys can go sort it out, because every problem in the world is everybody else's problem. None of it is America's problem. We are entirely innocent. We are this wonderful, generous, lovely country. And if you complain in any way about the fact that we're trying to take Greenland, take the Panama Canal, strip you of minerals, abandon you when we've promised to support you, well, you need to get over it. You're being pathetic, and you've had an easy ride, and it's time you grew up.
What worries me about this, after Trump won, I came in as chief of staff at Labor, and one of the things that I saw him do was he's taking a different tack this time, but in the first term, there were hundreds of vacant jobs, and these were really important jobs that help workers. These were people who inspected job sites to make sure they were safe. These were people who investigated wage theft claims and things like that. Their strategy was to just not fill the jobs, right, and to let it atrophy. So over the course of the 4 years, even to get back to baseline was a struggle. And that was exactly how it was designed, right? And so the similar allegory here is the problem I see is not just what Trump is doing. He's also exposed, to your point, just an underbelly of what executive power in the wrong hands could do with his executive orders, with what he's done with USAID. And so what I worry about is, even if Donald Trump does not try to stay on another term, even if all of a sudden tomorrow he woke up and realized what he was doing in terms of damage with America's reputation abroad, could we ever recover in the eyes of Europe, in the eyes of the world, to be the kind of example that you had described before all of this started?
No, there's no going back, I'm afraid. Because we sense that Trump's message resonates with a huge amount of the American public. That there is a very, very strong nationalist, isolationist sentiment in the US, regardless of who's president. That there is a lot of support for protectionism against free trade. That there's a lot of support for isolation. There's a lot of antipathy towards international laws, international organizations, international development. And so even if you were to elect a president who tried to behave a little bit more in the way that you behaved from 1945 to 2016, we're not going to be suckered 3 times. Right? We convinced ourselves after Trump won, well, maybe that was an aberration. The old America's back, we can deal with it the same way. Now what happens is we believe that the United States is a country that weaponizes any vulnerability. Any relationship you create with them, they will weaponize for money. Anything you take from them, they will use as a token to abuse you or humiliate you. I mean, it's gone from dealing with a relatively generous, long-term, traditional employer in whose company town you were living, to now dealing with the Sopranos. I mean, it genuinely, we now feel, I mean, who is going to really want to rely on an American defense guarantee in the future?
And do you
Who's
think
going to want to buy American defense equipment? I mean, Trump literally told a private company to turn off all the satellite and intelligence feed in Ukraine. So who's going to buy American products if the American president just turns off the product that you bought? Who's going to trust anything? Yeah.
Do you think another country takes up the mantle, or do you think it just becomes an increasingly isolationist world?
I think China will try hard to take up a lot of this mantle. Look, it's got a lot of problems. I mean, China is a terrifying alternative. But they play it long term. They're much more like the America of 45 to 2016. Look, Truman wasn't naive. Kennedy wasn't naive. Nixon certainly wasn't naive. Reagan wasn't naive. I mean, they understood that they had enormous power in the world, but they wielded that stick with a very soft voice. America got what it wanted done, but within a very predictable framework. America didn't need to turn around and say, do this or else, or give us $500 billion, or where's my present? I mean, literally, the president of the United States is saying to world leaders, I just spoke to an elected head of state of a major G7 country. And the message basically that he got was from Howard Lutnick, if you turn up to see Trump and you want a good trade deal, think about what present you want to bring him. So it seems to me that China is now going to try to say, for all our flaws, we're authoritarian, all this sort of thing, but we're predictable. We have 10-year plans, 20-year plans, 30-year plans. You can sign free trade agreements with us, and we'll stick to them. Yeah, we'll have power in the way that the US used to. We'll exercise influence. We'll push our interests. But we're not going to do it with a sort of short-term transactional. And people will be tempted by that. Southeast Asia will be tempted by that, very tempted by that. But also, I mean, imagine if you're Europe, right? You're struggling, you're facing tariffs with the US, your economy isn't going anywhere, you're trying to make a climate revolution, and China is delivering electric vehicles at 40% of the costs of other people's electric vehicles and offering to build battery factories for you. So China will do it. Now, the people who should be doing it, sadly, and are not, is the Old West, right? This should be the moment for Japan, Canada, South Korea, Australia, and Europe, and the United Kingdom to stand up for Western values, create an alternative access of a more liberal world order. But boy, oh boy, we're not managing to do that. What we're demonstrating is that we get picked off one by Trump.
One other aspect of the current state of affairs in the United States, especially with the government shutdown, that I'd love your perspective on is healthcare. There is a raging debate I'm sure you are following right now around whether to reopen the government and on what terms. The healthcare exchanges for the Affordable Care Act open on November 1st. People don't start paying the premiums until next year, but in terms of signing up for healthcare, they will see on November 1st, in some cases, 100% or more increase in their premiums. I think people don't have as good a perspective on the National Health Service and the system you have, but would just love your quick perspective on the differences. And we have a society where people are literally getting bankrupt because they get sick, and I know there's just such a different mentality over there.
Yeah, I mean, so there are many different public healthcare systems in the world and many different designs. In the United Kingdom, it's very straightforward. You pay your taxes in the normal way, and healthcare is completely free. Totally free at the point of use. Doesn't matter, right? My kid's sick. I go to the hospital. That's it. I have to wait in line, but there's no bill. I have no idea how much it costs. There's no attempt to calculate that. The NHS covers, the National Health Service covers the cost. And the result is that we spend about half as much on healthcare as the United States does. And on the general indicators for the general population, things like life expectancy, infant mortality, European countries are generally outperforming the US. In the US, you're paying twice as much for healthcare. And if you are wealthy and lucky, you can get the greatest healthcare in the world. If you want a specialist cancer doctor at Sloan Kettering, you can get that in the US where you can't get it. But for the average person, the statistics are shocking. Right? For the average person in the United Kingdom compared to the average person in the US in terms of the amount that you pay for healthcare and the actual outcomes, the US system is just performing much worse.
So Do you think that there is a world in which, there's obviously always a push for healthcare reform. There are forces that always are pushing back on it that are privately interested, et cetera. Do you think that there is a world in which the United States can get to a better place to providing quality, affordable healthcare, which I believe deeply in? And there's also like just a general fear mongering that happens for people who are candidly in the back pocket of some of these private interests that are saying, well, that your healthcare is going to be worse, or you're going to have like choices taken away from you. That's always the
Yeah.
cynical
Well,
knock.
I think the answer is to look at some of the systems that work well. I mean, Britain is a pretty cheap, basic system. So you probably don't want to go there. But actually, the French system, the Australian system, some of the Scandinavian systems, these are insurance-based systems that deliver very, very impressive outcomes at a lower cost than is the case in the United States, with higher outcomes. I mean, some of the Scandinavian countries are kind of out of the league in terms of where they are on life expectancy and infant mortality compared to the US or even the UK. So I think there are great models out there, and I think the US should remember that it's an historical anomaly that you now seem so much less progressive. When FDR was introducing his welfare reforms in the 1930s, he was ahead of the whole of Europe. Right? We looked at the US as the place that really sort of created some of the elements of the welfare state. It's an irony that by the 1980s, Americans began to look at what we see as the basic components for welfare state as socialism, and develop this narrative that it was getting in the way of living the American dream. But the truth is that if you, without overdoing this, broadly speaking, if you go to Denmark or Sweden or Switzerland, you don't have to be in the European Union, and compare it to going to Mississippi, I mean, the very poorest parts of Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, it doesn't look like Mississippi. It doesn't look like West Virginia. Right? These are countries which are, for better or for worse, providing better housing, better education, better infrastructure, better healthcare, and lower economic growth. But it depends whether, and of course it's on that Americans will be like, yeah, well, that's fine, but our economy is growing so fast. Well, great, but where's the proceeds of that going? Where do I see that in West Virginia? Where do I see that in Mississippi? What does this actually mean for an ordinary person?
My last question to you is where we started on people wanting to have a little bit of optimism. You famously, during your political career, walked thousands and thousands of miles, talked to many people where they were. It does feel like a very scary time, that people feel like there aren't a lot of people looking out for them, that there's not a lot to look forward to. What continues to give you hope? And what I like to ask our guests is that there's a lot of listeners who say, I want to take a message to my neighbor who says that they're done with politics, who says that they're done with civil society and just want to kind of like retreat to their own, their own couch or what have you. What's your advice to listeners to get those people reactive and engaged again?
Well, I think the advice to listeners is, if you've got a neighbor like that, you've got to make it personal. You've got to make them understand that something that seems very big and abstract and vague and doesn't concern them, in fact, concerns people they love. I mean, let's say you're talking about civil rights. If you just talk about what ICE agents are doing in some other part of the United States, your neighbor may not be very moved. If they can begin to see it in terms of someone they know and love, what it means for masked men to turn up, refusing to identify themselves, essentially immune from civil prosecution, etc. And the bigger argument, I think, which we need to keep coming back to, is never forget that in the end, good politics must be rooted in morality. And in the end, morality is about understanding that other people have the same rights that we do. It's just, we dress it up. We have kind of fancy jargon, human rights, solidarity, whatever. But the fact is, we're human. We're equal in dignity, right? We're equal in rights, fundamentally. And everything follows from that. Why are we looking after people who are starving to death in Uganda? Because their children are as valuable as our children. And if you create a nationalism that just draws a little circle around your own country and says, I only care about people inside my own country, I don't care about anyone else, you're on a slippery slope where pretty soon you're not going to be caring about minorities inside your own country either. You're not going to be caring about people outside your own family, ultimately. I mean, I had a confrontation with JD Vance on Twitter where it seemed to me that he was saying, basically, it's about his family. And that's fundamentally cannot be the message. Can't be the message of the Christian right, can't be the message of socialists, can't be the message of unions, can't be the message of liberals. All good politics of any sort is based in morality, and morality is about understanding that other people have claims which are equal to your own.
Rory Stewart, Rest is Politics podcast. Listen, subscribe. How many episodes have you done? Like 470 or something like that?
Yeah.
Pretty awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming on the People's Cabinet.
Thank you again. Thank you. Best wishes. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the People's Cabinet. If you did, please like, subscribe, ring that bell, and put in the comments below who else you'd like to see sworn in. And stay tuned for new episodes every Tuesday. Let's go.